The vast, unforgiving expanse of the North Pacific Ocean holds secrets, shadows, and sometimes the genesis of a new era. On April 18, 1942, at precisely 03:20 hours aboard the USS Hornet, a seemingly innocuous radio crackle shattered the pre-dawn quiet, igniting a chain of events that would forever alter the course of World War II and redefine the very nature of naval warfare. The lookout's voice, strained but urgent, pierced the bridge telephone. Surface contact bearing WW2 range 12,000 yards. Lieutenant Commander Frank Akers, his binoculars still trained on the distant horizon, knew instantly what this meant. This wasn't just a sighting. It was a premature death sentence for a mission so daring, so audacious, that even its architects had privately branded it suicidal. 16 B-25. Mitchell bombers, their hulking forms strapped precariously to the Hornet's wooden flight deck, were suddenly living on borrowed time. The Japanese picket boat, the Nito Maru, a converted fishing vessel now playing an unwilling role in a global conflict, had stumbled upon Task Force 16. This chance encounter, far from being a mere blip on the radar, was about to trigger the first American bombing raid on the Japanese homeland. An operation meticulously planned, yet now thrown into chaos. It was a mission born of desperation, forged in the crucible of defeat, and fueled by an unyielding desire for retribution after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. This was more than just a military strike. It was a psychological lightning bolt aimed directly at the heart of an empire, designed to shatter a myth of invincibility, and, in doing so, to rekindle the flickering flame of hope in a nation reeling from seemingly endless setbacks. As the Pacific dawn grudgingly broke, it revealed a scene of churning chaos. Mountainous waves relentlessly crashed over the Hornet's bow, sending plumes of icy spray high into the air. Wind speeds whipped past 40 knots, a relentless gale that threatened to tear aircraft from their moorings. Visibility plummeted to less than 5 miles, the world outside the ship's bridge a blurry canvas of driving rain and turbulent gray. These were not the conditions Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle had painstakingly trained for at Eglin Field, where sunny Florida skies and calm waters were the norm. This was an unforgiving, unpredictable environment, a brutal test of man and machine before the true mission had even begun. The launch point, now revealed to be 650 nautical miles from Japan, was a staggering 250 miles farther than originally planned. The stark calculations were a punch to the gut. Each B-25 carried 1,141 gallons of fuel, enough, at maximum cruise efficiency, to maybe reach the Chinese coast after bombing Japan. Maybe was a terrifying word in this context, a fragile hope clinging to the edge of catastrophe. This incredible gamble, this seemingly impossible venture, was not born in a vacuum. It was the direct, visceral response to a fundamental truth violently hammered home on December 7, 1941. Geographic isolation no longer guaranteed security. If Japanese carrier aircraft could strike Hawaii without warning, then Japan itself, despite its ancient island protections, must be equally vulnerable to American retaliation. The psychological equation was devastatingly simple, yet profoundly complex in its execution. Strike the Japanese homeland, and in doing so, shatter the myth of imperial invincibility that had sustained Japan's relentless expansion across the Pacific. This wasn't about inflicting massive physical damage. Not primarily. This was about a seismic shift in perception, a blow to the spirit, a demonstration that the impenetrable fortress could, in fact, be breached. President Franklin Roosevelt, a man known for his calm demeanor, was consumed by a righteous fury after Pearl Harbor. He demanded immediate retaliation. Not in 6 months. Not when America's industrial might could produce an overwhelming force. He demanded it now, while American bodies still floated in Pearl Harbor's oil-slicked waters, while Japanese forces advanced seemingly unopposed across the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. The American public needed proof, tangible and undeniable, that their nation could and would strike back. The morale of a nation hung in the balance, a nation that had for too long believed itself immune to the ravages of global conflict, only to be violently disabused of that notion. Admiral Ernest J. King, the formidable chief of naval operations, grasped the strategic implications with chilling clarity. Japan's defensive perimeter, a vast and fortified arc stretching from the frigid Kuril Islands to the balmy Dutch East Indies, was a formidable chain of fortified islands and naval bases. Penetrating it using conventional tactics would require years of grinding warfare, a slow, costly slog of island-hopping and amphibious assaults. But behind this seemingly impregnable screen lay the Japanese homeland itself, protected not by fortifications, but by the colossal distances of the Pacific, by carefully cultivated early warning networks, and, crucially, by the fundamental assumption, almost an article of faith, that no American bomber could possibly reach Tokyo from any existing Allied base. This was the hubris, the fatal flaw in Japanese strategic thinking, that the Doolittle Raid aimed to exploit. It was a gamble on exploiting an enemy's intellectual blind spot, a daring bet against conventional wisdom. The germ of the audacious idea had sprouted months earlier, in a place far removed from the Pacific battlefield. On January 10, 1942, Captain Francis Lowe, an operations officer on Admiral King's staff, witnessed something truly groundbreaking. At Naval Station Norfolk Chambers Field, he watched Army Air Force's bombers practicing carrier deck takeoffs. The runway was painted with the outline of a carrier deck for landing practice, a common enough sight. But twin-engine bombers launching from aircraft carriers? The concept violated every single principle of established naval aviation doctrine, a dogma steeped in decades of specialized training and experience. Naval aircraft were purpose-built for carrier operations, compact, robust, with powerful engines and short takeoff-landing capabilities. Medium bombers like the B-25 were land-based giants, designed for long runways and stable ground operations. Lowe's observation, however, wasn't just a curiosity. It was a spark. It ignited a revolution in strategic thinking, prompting the question, what if? What if the impossible wasn't so impossible after all? What if the very rules they thought they knew could be bent, or even broken, to achieve a strategic advantage? This was the kind of out-of-the-box thinking, the audacious lateral leap, that characterized the American response to a seemingly insurmountable challenge. It was a willingness to question deeply held assumptions, a trait that often defines innovation in times of crisis. The USS Hornet, the chosen vessel for this unprecedented mission, was a leviathan of steel and power. She displaced 19,800 tons standard, swelling to 2,500 tons fully loaded, a behemoth capable of carving its way through the Pacific swells. Her flight deck stretched an imposing 809 feet in length and 86 feet in width, a veritable airfield at sea. 4 Parsons geared steam turbines, generating an astonishing 120,000 shaft horsepower, drove the carrier through the waves at a blistering 32.5 knots. Captain Mark Andrew Meacher, a man whose name would become synonymous with carrier warfare, commanded a crew of 2,919 officers and men. But for this mission, his magnificent ship would carry no Navy aircraft. Every available square foot of her precious deck space was occupied by 16 U.S. Army Air Force's B-25B Mitchell medium bombers, an unprecedented and almost heretical sight for a Navy carrier. It was a testament to the inter-service cooperation and the desperate need for a unifying strike. At the helm of this audacious venture was Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle. Standing a mere 5'4" tall, his physical stature belied a reputation that towered over American aviation like a colossus. Doolittle was more than just a pilot. He was a titan of innovation and daring. With an MIT doctorate in aeronautical engineering, he possessed a profound understanding of the very physics that governed flight. His trophy cabinet glittered with accolades: the Schneider Trophy, the Thompson Trophy, the Bendix Trophy, markers of a pilot who pushed the boundaries of speed and endurance. He was the first pilot to perform an outside loop, a maneuver then considered impossible. He was the first to fly coast to coast in under 24 hours, a feat of endurance and navigation. And perhaps most critically for this mission, he was the first to take off, fly, and land using instruments alone, a pioneer of blind flight that would be vital for the perilous journey over the Pacific. At 45 years old, Doolittle had spent more time in experimental aircraft than most pilots had spent in the air. He was the embodiment of calculated risk, a man whose genius lay in his ability to see beyond the conventional, to dissect the impossible into a series of achievable, albeit dangerous, steps. He was, quite simply, the only man for the job. The B-25B Mitchell bomber itself represented American industrial adaptation at its finest. With a wingspan of 67 feet 7 inches and a length of 53 feet 6 inches, it was a substantial aircraft. Its empty weight of 21,100 pounds, powered by 2 Wright R-2613 Cyclone engines, each producing 1,700 horsepower, gave it a standard range of 1,350 miles with a 3,000-pound bomb load. But for this mission, standard specifications meant nothing. They were merely a starting point for radical transformation. The entire design philosophy had to be reevaluated, not for combat over land, but for a unique and perilous mission over the sea, launched from an unstable platform. This was not just about flying. It was about squeezing every ounce of capability from an already capable machine. North American aviation's engineers had performed what could only be described as mechanical surgery on each aircraft. The lower gun turret, a vital defensive component, was ruthlessly removed. This single modification saved a crucial 600 pounds of weight and, perhaps even more critically, eliminated the aerodynamic drag that would have cost precious fuel. In its place, and in other available voids, additional fuel tanks were meticulously installed in the bomb bay, the crawlway, and even the now empty lower turret space. This ingenious re-engineering increased the B-25's fuel capacity from a standard 646 gallons to a staggering 141 gallons, pushing its range far beyond its original design parameters. This wasn't just an upgrade. It was a fundamental reimagining of the aircraft's purpose and capability. Even the legendary Norden bomb sight, a top-secret marvel of American technology renowned for its accuracy, was deemed too complex, too delicate, and too valuable to risk falling into enemy hands. It was replaced with a far simpler, almost primitive device. A 20-cent creation designed by Captain Charles Ross Greening, constructed from materials readily available at any hardware store. This was wartime pragmatism at its most stark. Eschew sophistication for functionality, protect secrets, and adapt with ruthless efficiency. The emphasis was on getting the job done, even if it meant sacrificing the best for the good enough in the direst of circumstances. The logistics of the mission were unforgiving, a relentless gauntlet of challenges that pushed the boundaries of aeronautical engineering and human endurance. A standard carrier takeoff, even for much lighter naval aircraft, required approximately 500 feet of deck run. The B-25s, significantly larger and heavier, would have a mere 467 feet from their starting position to the Hornet's bow, a terrifyingly short distance. To compensate for this, the wind over the deck would need to exceed 40 knots, generating sufficient lift to coax these heavy bombers into the air. Each bomber, fully loaded with fuel and ordnance, weighed a colossal 31,000 pounds, nearly twice the weight of the Navy's largest carrier aircraft. The statistics alone were enough to make any seasoned pilot blanch. No Army bomber had ever launched from a carrier in combat, let alone one of this size, and no medium bomber had ever attempted a mission requiring a 2,400-mile flight over water without fighter escort. This was not merely difficult, it was unprecedented, a journey into the unknown depths of aviation. Meanwhile, the Japanese Homeland Defense System in April 1942 was a testament to 3 years of careful planning, and, more significantly, absolute confidence. The Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet, a force that had seemed unstoppable, controlled the vast western Pacific, from the frigid Aleutian Islands to the tropical expanse of Australia. Land-based aircraft provided overlapping coverage from chains of strategically placed island bases, creating what was believed to be an impenetrable aerial shield. Submarine patrol lines meticulously monitored all approaches to the home islands, a silent guardian beneath the waves. But the first line of defense, the one considered most basic and supposedly foolproof, was the picket boat line. This ingenious yet ultimately flawed system consisted of hundreds of converted fishing vessels, small, unassuming boats stationed at 50-mile intervals, extending 600 to 700 miles from the Japanese coast. Each boat, despite its humble appearance, carried vital radio equipment, capable of transmitting contact reports to naval headquarters in Tokyo. They were the eyes and ears of the empire, a tripwire designed to provide ample warning of any approaching enemy. The Nito Maru, the vessel that inadvertently triggered the raid, was officially listed as a 70-ton patrol vessel. In reality, it was a requisitioned fishing boat, crewed by 11 sailors and armed with nothing more than a single machine gun for defense. Its mission was simple, yet critical: spot American ships and radio their position before being sunk. This seemingly foolproof system reflected the deep-seated confidence of the Japanese High Command. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the architect of the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor and commander of the First Air Fleet, maintained with unshakable conviction that American carriers could not approach within 600 miles of Japan without detection. His 6 fleet carriers had demonstrated, at Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and Ceylon, that carrier aviation was the decisive weapon of naval warfare, and he believed Japan held an unassailable advantage. The nearest American bases capable of launching heavy bombers, such as the B-17 flying fortresses, were in the Aleutians, over 2,000 miles from Tokyo. Even the B-17s based in Australia were 3,000 miles away. The cold, hard mathematics of fuel consumption and bomb load made any conventional bombing raid on Japan utterly impossible. General Hideki Tojo, Prime Minister and War Minister, had personally assured Emperor Hirohito that the divine winds, the kamikaze, that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion centuries ago, would once again protect the homeland from American attack. The Japanese public had been fed a steady diet of propaganda, told that their islands were surrounded by an impenetrable defensive screen, that enemy aircraft would never darken Japanese skies. This absolute certainty, this deeply ingrained belief in their invulnerability, would make the psychological impact of the Doolittle Raid even more devastating than its relatively minimal physical damage. It was a cultural shockwave, a rude awakening that would shake the very foundations of their national psyche. The tension aboard the USS Hornet and the accompanying USS Enterprise, under the command of Admiral William Frederick Halsey, was palpable. At 0310 hours on April 18th, the radar operator aboard the Enterprise reported surface contact bearing 0280 range 21,000 yards. The contact was tracking southwest at 9 knots, directly across Task Force 16's intended track. Halsey, a man known for his aggressive spirit, faced an immediate, gut-wrenching decision: continue toward the optimal launch point and risk certain detection, or launch immediately from far beyond the planned range, gambling everything on a desperate throw of the dice. The stakes couldn't have been higher. At 0530, the Japanese picket boat Nitomaru spotted the American task force. Radio operator Seaman First Class Nakamura, fully aware of his life's precarious position, transmitted the contact report. 3 enemy carriers sighted. Position 650 nautical miles east of Inubosaki. Course west, speed 20 knots. The message was garbled by atmospheric interference, a chaotic dance of radio waves and electrical storms, but enough of it reached Tokyo to trigger an immediate, frantic alert. The system, for all its perceived infallibility, had worked. Halsey's dilemma had been decided for him. At 0538, the USS Nashville opened fire, its 6-inch guns straddling the small picket boat with the second salvo. The Nito Maru, a tiny blip against the vast Pacific, burned and sank within minutes, its crew tragically fulfilling their grim mission. But her warning had been transmitted. Halsey, understanding the gravity of the situation, made the only decision possible: launch immediately or abort the entire mission, squandering months of planning and the hopes of a nation. There was no real choice. At 0620, he signaled the Hornet, "Launch planes." Then, a message to Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command, a simple, profound statement carrying the weight of the world. Good luck, and God bless you. The deck of the Hornet was a scene of controlled chaos and unimaginable tension. Doolittle's B-25, tail number 40-2344, was positioned 467 feet from the bow, its engines idling, straining against the chocks. Navy Launch Officer Lieutenant Henry Miller, a picture of calm efficiency, stood at the port side of the deck, timing the carrier's agonizing pitch in the monstrous 30-foot swells. This wasn't just about speed. It was about precision, about catching the exact moment when the ship's bow dipped, creating an artificial incline and maximizing the brief lift for the overloaded bomber. As the Hornet's bow reached the bottom of a trough, Miller swung his checkered flag in a furious circle. the signal to advance throttles to maximum power. Flight engineer, Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard, watched the engine instruments with a hawk's intensity. Cylinder head temperatures climbing toward the red line, a testament to the immense strain. Co-pilot Lieutenant Richard Cole called out airspeed, his voice cutting through the roar as the bomber lumbered and accelerated down the spray-soaked deck. 40 knots, 50, 60. The white line marking the edge of the deck rushed toward them, an unforgiving boundary between life and death. At 8:20, with less than 50 feet of deck remaining, Doolittle pulled back on the control yoke. The B-25 staggered into the air, dipping precariously toward the waves as it momentarily lost the wind bursting over the carrier's bow. Then slowly, agonizingly, climbed into the gray Pacific dawn, a mechanical marvel defying gravity and the odds. 15 more bombers would follow at precise 4-minute intervals, each takeoff a nerve-wracking spectacle. Lieutenant Travis Hoover's aircraft cleared the deck with a mere 10 feet to spare, a hair-raising margin. Lieutenant Robert Gray's bomber dropped so low after launch that spray from the prop wash soaked the tail gunner's position, a visceral reminder of the ocean's unforgiving embrace. Captain David Jones watched green water break over his windscreen before his B-25 finally achieved a positive climb. Every pilot, every crewman, performed a miracle of aviation, launching overloaded bombers from a pitching deck into gale-force winds and a hostile, turbulent sky. It was a testament to their extraordinary skill, their unwavering courage, and the sheer desperation that fueled this historic flight. Once airborne, the 16 B-25s dispersed, flying individually toward Japan. They maintained strict radio silence, cloaked in the vastness of the ocean, and flew at wave-top height to evade radar detection, a harrowing flight inches above the churning water. Navigation was a rudimentary exercise in dead reckoning, relying on magnetic compasses and drift meters. There were no radio beacons to guide them, no weather updates to warn them, and certainly no fighter escort to protect them. Each 5-man crew was utterly alone. A tiny speck of defiance over 650 miles of hostile ocean, their fate resting on their skill, their intuition, and a heavy dose of luck. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle's bomber, the lead aircraft, reached the Japanese coast at 12:30 local time. Navigator Lieutenant Henry Potter, a silent hero of the raid, had calculated their position with astonishing accuracy, within 5 miles, despite flying through rain squalls and variable, treacherous winds. As they skirted the coastline, an eerie silence descended. The crew could clearly see Japanese civilians waving from fishing boats below, apparently believing the low-flying bomber was a Japanese patrol aircraft. The false gun barrels, ingeniously installed in the tail cones, had achieved their deception purpose, adding to the surrealism of the moment. Tokyo's air raid warning system, activated at 09 Juron based on the Nito Maru's report, had been stood down at noon when no enemy aircraft appeared, reinforcing the false sense of security. The population of 6.5 million was conducting normal Saturday activities, utterly unaware of the storm about to break. At 13:15 hours, Doolittle's bombardier, Staff Sergeant Fred Bramer, opened the bomb bay doors. 4 500-pound incendiary clusters tumbled from 1,200 feet, spreading a devastating blanket of fire across 10 city blocks in the Cheetah District. 30 seconds later, Lieutenant Travis Hoover's crew bombed the Tokyo Special Steel Company factory complex, its powderworks erupting in a column of flame visible from 20 miles away. Lieutenant Robert Gray struck the Tokyo Gas and Electric Company engineering facility, while Lieutenant Everett Holstrom hit the Agura Oil Company refinery. Captain David Jones dropped his bombs on military warehouses in the Yokohama district. Each bomber carried a specific target folder, but rapidly deteriorating weather, navigation errors, and the sudden appearance of anti-aircraft fire forced rapid tactical decisions, a testament to the crew's adaptability under fire. The second wave of bombers arrived over Japan between 13 and 14 hours, adding to the growing confusion and panic. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, piloting the Green Hornet, struck the steel mills at Yokohama despite heavy anti-aircraft fire, a testament to his resolve. Lieutenant Ted Lawson bombed the Nippon Machinery Works. Lieutenant Harold Watson hit the Tokyo Naval Arsenal, and Lieutenant Richard Joyce struck the Japan Special Steel Company. Each crew reported successful bomb runs, though damage assessment was impossible while flying at maximum speed toward the elusive Chinese coast. The primary objective, however, was already being achieved. Not just physical destruction, but the demolition of a psychological barrier. Not all made it to China. Captain Edward York faced critical mechanical failure 200 miles from Japan. His B-25's left engine was consuming fuel at twice the normal rate. Unable to reach China, York made a desperate decision, turning northwest toward Soviet territory, landing at Vladivostok after a grueling 6-hour flight. His crew would spend 14 months in Soviet internment, a diplomatic complication that Moscow deftly handled by officially denying their presence while privately treating them as guests, navigating the treacherous waters of wartime neutrality. Lieutenant William Farrow's bomber arrived over Nagoya as air defense fighters scrambled from Kasumigara Naval Air Station. 9 Mitsubishi A-6M Zero fighters, the terror of the Pacific skies, pursued Farrow's B-25, but the bomber's low altitude and maximum speed prevented effective interception. Corporal Jacob DeShazer, Farrow's bombardier, released 4 incendiary clusters over the Mitsubishi aircraft factory, destroying the paint shop and damaging the assembly building. The psychological impact multiplied with each bomb explosion. Tokyo had not heard air raid sirens since the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. Children ran screaming from schools. Office workers fled into the streets, a city suddenly confronted with the raw terror of war on its doorstep. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo himself, inspecting military bases during the raid, witnessed a B-25 come so close that he could reportedly see the pilot, an American face staring back at the supreme warlord of Japan. Though the American bomber never fired at him, the raid had irrevocably shattered the illusion of Japanese invulnerability. A sacred cow sacrificed on the altar of American defiance. As the B-25s turned toward China, the fuel gauges dropped toward empty faster than anyone had calculated. Headwinds exceeding 25 knots increased fuel consumption beyond even the worst-case planning scenarios. The Chinese airfield at Chuchao, supposedly ready to receive the bombers with homing beacons and runway lights, remained dark and silent. Radio calls went unanswered, swallowed by the vast, uncooperative night. The crews faced an impossible choice: bail out over unknown territory, plunging into darkness and uncertainty, or attempt perilous water landings, a controlled ditching that few aircraft, let alone heavy bombers, were designed to survive. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's B-25 struck the water at 110 mph, attempting a controlled ditching. The impact tore the bomber in half, throwing Lawson through the windscreen. His injuries were horrific: a compound fracture of the left leg, severe lacerations to his face, and multiple broken teeth. Navigator Lieutenant Charles McClure, despite his own injuries, pulled the unconscious pilot from the sinking aircraft, saving his life. Gunner David Thatcher, demonstrating incredible fortitude, swam repeatedly into the fragmented fuselage to rescue vital equipment and medical supplies, putting his own life at risk for his comrades. Adding to the chaos, the Chinese military had not been informed of the raid, due to security concerns and communication failures. General Chiang Kai-shek learned of the mission only when bombers began arriving over Chinese territory. Chinese ground forces, mistaking the low-flying B-25s for Japanese bombers, opened fire with anti-aircraft weapons, a tragic irony. Lieutenant Donald Smith's bomber was hit by ground fire near Nanchang, forcing the crew to bail out over Japanese-occupied territory, compounding their already perilous situation. Weather conditions over China deteriorated rapidly after sunset. Cloud ceilings dropped to a dangerous 500 feet. Visibility decreased to less than 1 mile. Mountain peaks rose to 6,000 feet along the planned route, unseen dangers in the oppressive darkness. Without radio beacons or accurate maps, crews flew by instinct and sheer luck, navigating a terrifying gauntlet of unforeseen obstacles. Fuel exhaustion became an inevitable reality as gauges touched empty between 22 Hus and 24-hour hours. Lieutenant Harold Watson ordered his crew to bail out at 11,000 feet when both engines quit from fuel starvation. The 5 men landed across 20 miles of mountainous terrain in Jiangxi province. Watson's parachute caught in a tree, leaving him suspended 30 feet above the ground in freezing rain for 6 agonizing hours before Chinese farmers, hearing his desperate shouts, cut him down. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's crew represented one of the final harrowing tests of the mission's success. After bombing Yokohama, Hallmark flew the Green Hornet west toward China as darkness fell. Navigator Lieutenant Chase Nielsen calculated they had passed the Chinese coast, but no airfields appeared, only an endless expanse of dark, undulating land. Fuel gauges read empty, both engines running on nothing but vapor. At 23:45 hours, Hallmark gave the order: prepare for crash landing. The B-25 struck the water near the Chinese coast with devastating force. The impact threw Hallmark against the instrument panel, causing severe head injuries. Co-pilot Lieutenant Robert Matter was knocked unconscious. Bombardier Staff Sergeant William Dieter and Engineer Corporal Donald Fitzmaurice tragically drowned in the sinking aircraft. Nielsen, remarkably, managed to escape through the broken canopy and, with immense effort, pull Hallmark and Mieter to shore, their lives saved by a combination of luck and raw determination. Lieutenant William Farrow's crew faced a similar disaster. After bombing Nagoya, Farrow's bomber ran out of fuel over Chinese territory. The crew bailed out into complete darkness at 8,000 feet. Bombardier Corporal Jacob DeShazer landed in a rice paddy filled with human waste, used as fertilizer. Covered in excrement, disoriented, lost, and unable to speak Chinese, DeShazer wandered for hours before a devastating encounter with a Japanese patrol. He would spend 40 months in solitary confinement, subjected to repeated torture for information about American carriers, a testament to the brutality of war. Farrow and navigator Lieutenant George Barr were captured within hours of landing. Engineer Sergeant Harold Spotts was brutally beaten unconscious by Japanese soldiers who found him hiding in a Buddhist temple. Co-pilot Lieutenant Robert Hite was captured while seeking help from Chinese villagers who had been tragically threatened with execution if they aided American airmen. The Japanese response was swift, merciless, and brutal, underscoring the high price of this daring raid. Emperor Hirohito, deeply affronted by the attack, personally ordered that captured airmen be executed as war criminals. The Doolittle Raiders, critically, had not worn military uniforms during the raid, technically making them spies under international law, a flimsy but lethal pretext. 8 captured crewmen were subjected to mock trials in Shanghai, a macabre parody of justice. Lieutenants Farrow and Hallmark, along with Sergeant Spatz, were executed by firing squad on October 15, 1942. The remaining 5, Lieutenants Chase Nielsen, Robert Hite, George Barr, and Corporal Jacob DeShazer, and Lieutenant Charles McClure, who was captured later but not executed, were sentenced to life imprisonment. The execution of these brave men was a stark reminder of the savage realities of war and the extreme consequences of defying a determined enemy. Despite the heavy toll, a remarkable 69 of the 80 Doolittle Raiders eventually reached safety in free China, a testament to the courage of the Chinese resistance and the resilience of the airmen. 3 tragically died in crash landings or drowning. 8 were captured by Japanese forces, and 1 crew was interned in the Soviet Union. Every single B-25 was lost, destroyed in crashes, or abandoned to prevent capture. The material damage to Japan, in terms of buildings and infrastructure, was indeed minimal. 50 dead, 252 wounded, 112 buildings destroyed or damaged. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle, standing in a Chinese rice field beside his crashed bomber, felt the crushing weight of responsibility. He considered the raid a complete failure, convinced he would face a court-martial for losing his entire force. "I've lost all 16 planes," he despaired to his crew. "The mission was supposed to boost American morale, and all I've done is prove bombers can't operate from carriers." But his engineer, Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard, offered a prophetic reply. "Colonel, you've just won the Medal of Honor." Leonard's words, though perhaps meant to console, would prove uncannily accurate. The true victory of the Doolittle Raid was never about the bombs dropped. It was about the seeds of doubt sown and the spirit of a nation reignited. The Japanese Navy's reaction to the raid was immediate, ferocious, and ultimately catastrophic for their long-term strategy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant but increasingly frustrated commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, had been eating breakfast when informed of the attack. He remained silent for 30 minutes, digesting the unthinkable, before issuing orders that would directly lead to Japan's first major defeat. The Midway operation, a risky venture previously considered unnecessary by the Naval General Staff, was approved immediately. Yamamoto, his pride wounded and his strategic assumptions shattered, was determined to destroy the American carriers that had dared to humiliate the supposedly invincible Japanese Navy. This act of retaliation, born of rage and strategic miscalculation, would prove to be one of the most decisive turns of the entire Pacific War. Meanwhile, President Roosevelt announced the raid to the American public with masterful, calculated misdirection. When asked by reporters where the bombers had launched from, he famously smiled and said, "Shangri-La," referencing the fictional Himalayan paradise from James Hilton's novel. The American public, desperate for good news after months of demoralizing defeats, erupted in celebration. This first strike against the Japanese homeland, however symbolic, was a psychological triumph. War bond sales, a crucial indicator of national confidence and support, increased by a staggering 20% in the week following the announcement. The Doolittle Raid's strategic impact, therefore, far exceeded its physical damage. It was a shot in the arm for American morale, a tangible sign that the tide could turn. The raid also triggered a cascade of unintended yet profoundly significant strategic consequences for Japan. 4 Japanese Army fighter groups, critically needed in other theaters of war, were recalled from the Southwest Pacific to defend the homeland. These squadrons were desperately required in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, where their absence directly contributed to crucial American victories at the Coral Sea and Guadalcanal. Furthermore, the Japanese Navy, driven by Yamamoto's singular obsession with eliminating the American carrier threat, accelerated the Midway operation by 6 weeks. This compressed timeline allowed insufficient time for proper planning and coordination, setting the stage for disaster. But the Chinese people, America's staunch but beleaguered ally, paid the highest price for American success. Japanese forces launched Operation Siago, a brutal retaliatory campaign in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, precisely where Doolittle's crews had landed. General Shunroku Hata deployed 100,000 troops with explicit orders to destroy all Chinese who might have aided the Americans. The scale of the atrocity was horrific. Entire villages were burned to the ground. Wells were deliberately poisoned with cholera and typhoid bacteria, creating a silent, insidious killer. An estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians died in the 3-month campaign of systematic extermination, a tragic and often overlooked chapter in the Doolittle Raid's legacy, a sobering reminder that even victories can have devastating human costs for those caught in the crossfire. Beyond the immediate strategic fallout, the Doolittle Raid provided invaluable technological lessons that transformed American bombing doctrine. The success of the low-level attack profiles, necessitated by the need to avoid radar, led directly to the development of skip bombing techniques that would later devastate Japanese shipping throughout the Pacific. The B-25's remarkable performance under extreme conditions inspired modifications that created the heavily armed Straffer variants, equipped with forward-firing machine guns, used throughout the Pacific War. North American aviation engineers, building on the raid's experience, developed the B-25G and H models, mounting formidable 75mm cannons in the nose, effectively turning medium bombers into flying artillery pieces, a revolutionary concept that significantly enhanced their ground attack capabilities. Admiral Yamamoto's personal obsession with eliminating the American carrier threat, a direct consequence of the Doolittle Raid's psychological blow, led directly to the Battle of Midway on June 4, 1942. The Japanese Navy committed 4 fleet carriers to the operation, convinced that overwhelming force would achieve a decisive victory. However, American codebreakers, intercepting and deciphering Japanese naval communications, positioned 3 American carriers for a devastating ambush. In a mere 5 minutes, dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown destroyed the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was sunk hours later. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable experienced aircrews at Midway represented damage from which the Japanese Navy never truly recovered. The ships could eventually be replaced, albeit slowly. The highly trained, battle-hardened pilots, forged in the fire of months of combat, could not. Years of specialized training and combat experience vanished beneath the Pacific waves in a single, catastrophic afternoon. The tactical advantage in carrier aviation shifted permanently to the United States, a strategic reversal that traced its origins directly back to those 16 B-25s launched from the USS Hornet on that stormy April morning. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle, far from facing a court-martial, received the Medal of Honor from President Roosevelt at the White House on May 19, 1942. He was promoted directly to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel entirely, a testament to his extraordinary achievement. He would go on to command the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean, and finally the mighty 8th Air Force in England, leaving an indelible mark on the global conflict. Every member of the raid received the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Chinese government, recognizing their immense sacrifice and bravery, awarded the raiders the prestigious Order of the Cloud and Banner. The human cost and enduring spirit of the Doolittle Raid resonated through decades. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's harrowing memoir, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, became a national bestseller and was adapted into a classic Hollywood film, immortalizing the raid's drama and sacrifice for generations. But perhaps no story embodies the raid's profound, lasting impact more than that of Corporal Jacob DeShazer. After 40 months of brutal Japanese captivity, enduring torture and solitary confinement, DeShazer returned to Japan as a missionary. In an astonishing act of forgiveness and reconciliation, he eventually converted one of his former prison guards, Sergeant Kazuo Kanemoto, to Christianity. This remarkable testament to the power of human spirit and forgiveness in the face of unimaginable suffering stands as one of the most poignant legacies of the raid. Lieutenant Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, lived to the remarkable age of 103, passing away in 2019 as the last surviving Doolittle Raider, a living link to an almost mythical event. The technical specifications that made the raid possible became foundational military doctrine. Carrier-based aviation, once primarily seen as a defensive arm for the fleet, evolved into a powerful tool for power projection, capable of striking deep into enemy territory. The concept of joint operations between Army and Navy forces, revolutionary and contentious in 1942, became standard practice, a model for future inter-service cooperation. Special operations, requiring extreme range and minimal support, trace their heritage directly to those 16 bombers launching into an impossible mission, laying the groundwork for many of the covert and audacious missions of today. Japanese military historians would later identify the Doolittle Raid as the psychological turning point of the Pacific War. Not Pearl Harbor, which had energized Japanese confidence and hubris. Not Midway, which was still 2 months away and a direct consequence of the raid. But the moment when American bombers appeared over Tokyo, proving that the vast ocean barriers that had protected Japan for 1,000 years meant absolutely nothing in the new age of carrier aviation. The illusion of safety, painstakingly built over centuries, crumbled in a single afternoon. The execution of the 3 Doolittle Raiders haunted the Japanese military command, and later became a focal point of post-war trials. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, barely able to stand due to his severe injuries, walked to his execution with immense dignity. At 4:30 p.m. on October 15, 1942, at Public Cemetery No. 1 outside Shanghai, Hallmark, Faro, and Spatz were tied to small crosses and blindfolded. Given a moment for silent prayer, they were then shot by firing squad, their bodies cremated, an act considered by the Japanese to be the ultimate dishonor. Lieutenant Robert Mader, Hallmark's co-pilot who survived the crash and was also captured, died in captivity on December 1, 1943, from malnutrition and dysentery, a slow and agonizing end. The surviving prisoners, Nielsen, Haidt, Barr, and DeShazer, endured 3.5 years of torture, starvation, and solitary confinement before their liberation in August 1945. Their survival, against all odds, was attributed to mutual support, a smuggled Bible, and a sheer, unyielding determination to outlive their captives. Their story stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the darkest of circumstances. The operational statistics of the Doolittle Raid remained staggering even in retrospect. 16 bombers, each weighing 31,000 pounds, launching from a carrier deck in 40-knot winds and 30-foot seas, flying 650 miles to targets they had never seen, navigating by compass and intuition, dropping 64,000 pounds of ordnance across 5 Japanese cities in broad daylight, and then flying another 1,500 miles to attempted landings in darkness over unknown, hostile terrain. This was not merely a military operation. It was an act of supreme courage, innovation, and sheer human will, pushing the limits of what was then believed possible. The USS Hornet, the intrepid carrier that launched the Doolittle Raiders, would survive only 6 more months after that fateful mission. Sunk at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands on October 26, 1942, she took 140 aircraft and 111 crew members to the bottom of the Pacific. But her legacy was irrevocably secured on April 18th, when 16 Army bombers accomplished what Japanese military planners had declared impossible. The Doolittle Raid represented far more than a military operation. It demonstrated, with powerful clarity, that creativity could overcome numerical disadvantage, that courage could substitute for resources, and that a mere 16 aircraft could fundamentally change the strategic balance of the world's largest war. The Japanese learned a brutal, undeniable lesson. Their homeland was vulnerable, their perceived invincibility a fragile illusion. The Americans, in turn, learned an equally vital lesson. They could win, that their spirit was unbroken, and that ingenuity could pierce the darkest clouds of despair. Both lessons, etched in fire and blood, would profoundly shape the Pacific War's bloody progression toward Tokyo Bay, and, ultimately, unconditional surrender. In the archives of the National Museum of the United States Air Force, a twisted piece of aluminum bears the serial number 42267. It is all that remains of Lieutenant Edgar McElroy's B-25, recovered from a Chinese mountainside in 1962. The metal is scarred by impact, weathered by decades of exposure to the elements, a silent testament to its violent end. But forensic analysis revealed something astonishing. Traces of Tokyo factory smoke, microscopically embedded in the aluminum, molecular evidence of a mission that proved heavy bombers could launch from aircraft carriers and, in doing so, change the course of history. The final, perhaps most poignant measure of the Doolittle Raid's impact came from an unexpected source. In 1959, Prince Nobuhito Takamatsu, Emperor Hirohito's own brother, attended a reunion of Doolittle's raiders in Tucson, Arizona. When asked why he had come, the prince, with a profound understanding of history, replied, "Your 16 planes changed our world. They proved that courage and innovation could defeat tradition and expectation. The bombs you dropped on Tokyo were small. The ideas you dropped were devastating. This statement, from the heart of the imperial family, perfectly encapsulates the raid's true legacy. Every modern carrier aircraft launching from American flight decks today carries the indelible heritage of April 18, 1942. Every joint service operation, a hallmark of contemporary military strategy, builds on the unprecedented precedent established when Army Air Forces and Navy personnel proved that service boundaries meant nothing when national survival was at stake. The Doolittle Raid did not win the Pacific War in a single stroke, but it accomplished something perhaps even more important. It proved unequivocally that the Pacific War could be won. The 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers that launched from the USS Hornet carried more than just bombs and fuel. They carried the concentrated will of a nation that had been bloodied but not broken. They carried the promise that geographic distance provided no sanctuary from American retaliation. They carried the future of carrier aviation, special operations, and joint service cooperation. Most importantly, they carried the undeniable proof that in modern warfare, the impossible was merely difficult, and the difficult was merely Tuesday.